Hi, I'm Amy Willis with Adam Smith Works.
And I'm Ryan Hanley of Boston College.
Great. Hi, Ryan. Thanks for joining us for an Ask Me Anything based on your most recent book, Our Great Purpose.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a delight to be here.
We're happy to have you. We recently completed a virtual reading group on your book with a
Mhm.
number of participants, and we gave them the opportunity to suggest some questions that they might want to ask you. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and start asking you those questions.
Fire away.
Awesome. One of the things that the group talked about a lot, and they gave their suggestions, but now they want to know yours. Is there one chapter among the many chapters of this book that you feel is the most important?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
It is.
I have my favorite chapters, and there were the chapters that were the most fun to write. And they're the chapters that I think had me rethink some things in Smith that I've been thinking about for some time. But if I could only suggest one chapter for the busy reader that only wanted to do about 4 pages of the book, I do think chapter 3, largely because of what Smith says, not necessarily because of what I say, but it's the chapter with the lift quote from TMS Part 2, where he tells us the quote, "Man was made for action and to promote by the exertion of his faculties such changes in the external circumstances of both himself and others as may seem most favorable to the happiness of all." I think that's a pretty important one, both because of the what it encourages us to do as individual actors, but also for how it encourages us to rethink Smith. I think that's one of those moments in the book and in one of those moments in the theory of moral sentiments where, aha, the popular reputation of the man is in to some degree disaccord with the claims on their surface. And so I think that chapter 3 is one place where I don't want to say that any one part is important particularly, but I think that that's one that really gives us some insight into, the real Smith that goes beyond the surface story.
Yeah. So a lot of people did also recommend that chapter, and they had a similar debate about, well, what constitutes sort of the most important chapter of the book? Or
Yeah.
I like what you said about, well, some were more fun and some are, some are more important. So related to that first question, the group again also wants to know, how did you determine the chapter sequence in presenting Smith on living a life? And related to that, why did it take so long to get to the chapters about loved and lovely and the impartial spectator?
Oh, those are great chapters. Yes. How we organize our books, both as authors today and also as we read Smith himself. I think that this is a question well worth asking. I hope that one of the things maybe that readers of Smith do is ask, why does Smith begin here and end there? So, one thing, of course, that he does is he himself begins his book with part 1 on sympathy and propriety, and he works all the way up to part 6 on the theory of virtue, before, of course, he gives us the wrap up in part 7 with the other theories. So, you could think, on one level, I've wondered if maybe there's a bit of an ascent. Smith begins with the things that are most in us by nature, sympathy, most importantly. And then he sort of works up to what a more developed nature might look like, working his way up to virtue. I won't say that I simply copied that model in my book, but I did want to begin with the things that Smith himself feels are most central to us. And so I begin with the familiar aspects of Smith, talking about self interest. And he tells us very explicitly, every man is naturally concerned with his own care. And so these are the things that are most universal, most familiar to us. And then I wanted to sort of work from there. Whether it's upwards or not, I'll leave it to readers to judge. But the things that are most familiar, most natural, as it were, and to move from there to the things that require cultivation, study, appreciation, and perspective. And so I'm delighted that people were thinking about the question of love in particular, because that's both something that's natural to us, but also something that requires some work and some development.
Yeah.
So it couldn't come first, but it couldn't wait until coming last.
That's great. I love that characterization of assent. That's useful. And don't worry, there are more questions about love coming your way. So
All right, good.
we're not done with that topic. Um, One of our participants, Matt, asks the following. He said that Smith proposes the impartial spectator as an objective way for a person to scrutinize their conduct. And it seems that to do so, he must do this based on his understanding of other people around him. So this being the case, one must wonder to what degree this spectator is truly objective. Because after all, the customs, the norms, and the morals of one culture can be really different from those of another, and the appropriate course of action might change within these contexts. So does the impartial spectator reside within a specific cultural context, or must it transcend these and extend to all humankind?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I think that the questioner, Matt, is absolutely right to say that the impartial spectator begins literally as a spectator with what is before him or her. And those are naturally the things that are most proximate and closest to us, so the things within our own culture. And so inescapably, the spectator begins as a spectator of seeing what happens around him or her. If the impartial spectator stopped there, though, he or she would, of course, be nothing other than simply the mere cipher of whatever happened to be around them at the time. So there's this, I think of it in Smith as sort of the second order operation that has to happen. The spectator is always a spectator, but the spectator is also a reflective and judging spectator. So there's this complex dialectic where the spectator is simultaneously studying what he or she sees before them in the world, but then stepping back from that, reflecting, making judgments, and tapping into more universal qualities that go with reason. And so I think that there's always that interesting balance where the spectator is neither all one thing or another. I was just teaching Kant in my undergraduate class, and on the heels of actually teaching Smith. And one thing the students always see very clearly is that when Kant talks about universal laws that are known and apprehended by reason, that is a much more extreme formulation of perhaps a certain side of one of the things the spectator does, but it's not the only thing. And so that balance between both being grounded in a culture that you're seeing, observing, spectating, but also stepping back from that culture to reflect, to think, and to judge, both of those have to happen. And if you do one without the other, it's really hard to sustain the enterprise.
Awesome. So we have a follow-up question to that, but I might also hope I'm happy to speak on behalf of the group in
Mhm.
this regard, and that maybe you could give us some suggestions on Kant pairings to go along with Smith. That could make
Oh,
for an excellent reading group going forward.
uh-huh.
But the follow-up question we'd ask about this with relation to the impartial spectator within a larger sort of cultural context, could an impartial spectator actually be evil if a person is born into a circumstance with weak or no good acts, good characters, and good lives to emulate, as Smith suggests?
Yeah, Smith does worry to a significant degree about the question of what he himself calls corruption. That is, if indeed our moral norms, our perspective on the world is shaped first and foremost by our environment, as Smith thinks it is, and especially if we desire the sympathy of those around us, well, if the people around us are praising us for things that are morally problematic, that could be really an issue. Um, uh, this semester, when I was teaching my graduate students, we came to think of this as the Hitler Youth problem, which is um, I, I, if all the authorities around are praising action X, of course, individuals, especially people prior to the development of their reason, are going to conform by doing things that objectively we can see are, to say the least, deeply morally problematic. So, but this is the difference between just being a moral agent and
Mm.
cultivating an impartial spectator. So while Smith does think that we are influenced sympathetically by the reactions and judgments of people around us, the impartial spectator is also actively, if it's working correctly, uh, refining, going to work on, correcting, improving, elevating some of those instinctive, sympathetic responses that the individual moral actor is generating. So when Smith always is talking about, and I try and make a big deal about this because I think it's such wonderful language in Smith, about how we divide ourselves in two. We
Mhm.
both are actors simultaneously and spectators of ourselves. Again, that sort of balance, if we're just the sympathetic actors, we're just going to be chasing the esteem of other people. And that doesn't leave us that opportunity to step back and to reflect upon whether these judgments that others are making are right and wrong. Are we actually living up to being praiseworthy in our own eyes and not just trying to fit in the mold of others? So those wonderful passages Smith describes, where he thinks that we have to split ourselves into two, this is really, I think, an important part of what it means to have not just chasing sympathy, but also having that reflective, spectatorial perspective on ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thanks, Ryan. I think in our group, rather than the Hitler Youth problem, it was identified effectively as the social media problem.
Yes. Well, this is. Yeah, I'd be curious to see how that came out. People suggested then that we curate ourselves to appear a certain way on social media. Is that the sort of issue that came up?
I think that was part of it, but also, as you were saying, when people are given sort of commendations, likes, if you will, for things
Oh,
that
yes.
might not be particularly praiseworthy, and how that might distort that sort of cultural context that the spectator is evaluating himself within, right? So,
There should be another button, right, on social
yeah.
media. So like is just that immediate expression of one's sentiment. But there should be like another button that you can only click after 2 minutes or something that's good.
A
I'm just coming up with
thoughtful
this now.
like.
We're going to revolutionize social media now. But no, but there's that idea that you have to have judgment that goes beyond instinct. And of course, what social media rewards is immediate instinctive approbation.
Yeah, I mean, I remember how controversial it was when dislikes in some way, shape, or fashion became
I
possible, right?
forgot
So,
about that. Yes.
all right, off of the social media topic and on to a new one. Again, this is a sort of an amalgam question from the group, and it is this. You question in the book whether the poor among us today have sufficient opportunities to better their condition. And you address how Smith valued commercial society for its capacity to relieve poverty. How might poverty impair virtue development? And how does happenstance, again, this is sort of related to the last question, say, for instance, being born into property ownership or being born into poverty, matter?
Yeah, I think that this opens up some questions that go well beyond even the theory of moral sentiments and bring us into the world of the wealth of nations. But the question of the ways in which economic opportunity and opportunities for personal development may or may not coincide. I have to defer, I know the limits of my expertise, that I have to defer to economists today who know the statistics on economic opportunity much better than I do. So I won't try and prognosticate upon the world in which we live in that particular way. But I will say that I think one thing that Smith would worry about are, among other things, the development of virtue, the cultivation of impartiality. These are things that require, to some degree of leisure, or to use Smith's own word, tranquility. And so individuals that have economic means that are better able to carve out space for tranquility and such things, it's not difficult to imagine how on a Smithian framework there might be certain opportunities for personal development that are simply unavailable to those who have to work the extended double shifts and night shifts and these sorts of things. So there's nothing profound in that per se, and perhaps nothing uniquely Smithian in that. But Smith does recognize that tranquility is both a good unto itself, as well as a condition that provides us an opportunity to further cultivate ourselves. And I think that Smith would welcome a world in which tranquility is possible. Now, that opens up big questions of whether ours is such a world. And I think that we have to be very discriminating and pointing to different aspects of it to try and figure out if indeed it is such a world. But I think that tranquility is really central to his project more largely. Yeah.
All right, a different strain. Alice wants to know if you think that Smith considered himself as one in a multitude. So in other words, could he have been born with an innate talent that differentiated him from the street porter at birth, beyond what custom, habit, and education could affect? And what do you think Smith would say about other unusual talents, perhaps in today's world? Some of the examples our group having mentioned being such like Stephen Hawking or Simone Biles, or any number of sort of exceptional individuals.
Oh, that's really interesting. The case of Smith is fascinating, and the direct question of, did Smith consider himself to be one of the multitude? I really love that question. And I haven't posed it in precisely that way, but I always ask myself the question. And I've been asked it by one of my good teachers way back in graduate school, got me thinking about these things. And the question was, how could Smith justify the life that he lived based upon the principles that he lays out in his works? And I think that's a great question to ask of Smith, of any philosopher. I think Smith was uniquely sensitive to this, and in a lot of places is working out his own questions about what we would today call identity. But I think Smith himself would consider, in terms of his purpose and the value of his enterprise, as an intellectual writing about political economy and moral philosophy. So, did Smith consider himself to be one of the multitude? I suspect Smith, like the wise and virtuous man who aspires to understand himself that way, I think Smith knew that he was pretty good at what he did. And I suspect Smith knew that he was onto something with the wealth of nations. I suspect that Smith also actively tried to resist the sort of pride or hubris or we happy few sort of moments that sometimes come with the vanity that comes with knowledge. I think Smith was very dedicated to making sure that the sort of knowledge that he cultivated, the principles he laid forth in his books, I think he took very seriously the idea that these were in some deep way useful to the society in which he lived and could be useful for future generations. Did he consider himself to be one of the multitude? We don't have the window into his soul, partially thanks because he burned all those letters on his deathbed and manuscripts. I know, it keeps me up at night. But without sort of trying to make that sort of direct injunction or direct analysis of his position, I think that he was very conscious in thinking about the ways in which intellectual achievements and intellectual productions, like books, could influence for the better cultures, societies, polities, and the lives of real people. And so, in TMS at the end of part 4, he describes these, part 4.1, he describes these political disquisitions and the way in which they can impact and have beneficial effects on the life of a nation and the life of a people. And I think Smith was never the cloistered intellectual and wanted to write books of that sort that would have benefits for, not in a pejorative way, for the multitude, meaning for people outside of the local cadre of scholars with which he worked. And so I think it's a really interesting way of looking at intellectual life. And I think Smith was really dedicated and personally invested in making sure that his work was out there in the world and had certain effects that were beneficial for the quote unquote multitude, or what we would say have popular effect.
Sure. Well, speaking of Smith's personal life, Caroline wants to know the following. She says that you beautifully explained Smith's view that we want to be loved and how much loving others contributes to our own happiness. However, and as you also note, Smith has few positive comments about romantic love. Is this a gap in his guide to living a better life?
Yes. I mean, how about we just point blank it right there?
Okay.
Sometimes when I give talks, I'm asked, do you think that Smith got everything right? And I say, well, I think he got a lot right, but the one place where I think he gets some things wrong, and I think one has to say it, is on the question of romantic love. Look, again, we don't have the window into his soul, and I don't like to make those sorts of, I don't want to speak for him. Why he has that blinder, I don't know, but I'm willing to call it a blinder. I think what he describes is very beautiful, our love needingness. Maybe the thing he describes isn't beautiful, but he describes it beautifully, where he really does capture this human need to be loved by others. And that's, of course, a fundamental and central part of romantic love. Smith tends to express that in his private life in other ways. He has a remarkable letter about the passing of his mother, which far eclipses, as far as I know, any other more personal statement that he makes about any other individual who might have loved him. And it deserves to be read on its own terms, so I won't try and paraphrase it here. But suffice it to say that I think Smith felt this need as a human being. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem to have been expressed in a romantic way. I choose not to go to speculate beyond that, other than to say that that's one part of the phenomenology of Smith's description of real life, where I feel like I'm just to say the least, happy that oh goodness, I'm just going to full stop it there because anything is going to get me into trouble beyond that. But suffice it to say that the life of the um, cloistered bachelor philosopher has its great benefits, no doubt, but I think also some of its limits.
Sure. Well, while we're on subjects that Smith may have been a little cagey about, we might as well do this next one too, because
Okay.
our friend John wants to know this. He says in your chapter 29, you
Uh-huh.
discuss Smith's thoughts, excuse me, on the benefits of the idea of God related to promoting moral action and the concept of the impartial spectator. Beyond how having the concept of God in mind could help, do you think that Smith thought there was any aspect or characteristic of the impartial spectator that was divine instead of human?
Oh, well, that's very interesting. I mean, so look, on one level, yes. I mean, Smith, when he writes about conscience in TMS3, is drawing on a long tradition of understanding conscience as implanted within us and is, to use more colloquial language, the spark of the divine within us. So I think that there is a very complex story to be told, and I won't go down that rabbit hole here, but I've been spending a lot of time with Smith's engagement, striking engagement with 17th century French Catholic theology. Even on its surface, if one counts up the authors that Smith actually cites in the theory of moral sentiments, the longest passages in the book come from Massillon. He's also interested in the Abbé Dubois, and we could go Malebranche. We could go down on the list, but that's an important side of the discussion here that I think scholars now are beginning to be more sensitive to, but ties Smith to a very long way of thinking about the place of the divine in human life. I'll put all that to the side here because we can save that for sort of more academic conferences. But the question here at issue, I think, is to what degree issues of divinity might actually play in practical moral life. And I think that Smith actually has quite a bit of interesting things to say about religion's place in moral life. Some of it has to do with, as your questioner notes, the existence of God, which is something that's often in the background. But another place where Smith brings this up, and I think is really adds to the Enlightenment discussion of the relation of religion to morality, is this really striking discussion he has in TMS Part 3, Section 5, where he describes the quote unquote natural sentiments of religion.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very interesting way of talking about religion. It's not natural religion, which is how a lot of people talked about it at the time, in terms of the divine providence and the watchmaker universe and all these sorts of things. It's rather there are natural sentiments within us that incline us to certain religious beliefs. Now, what he may have meant by that, if only he had said more. But I would recommend to readers interested in this question, really the passages in Part 3, Chapter 5 are really fascinating for opening up a very different space, and I think a space very different from his good friend Hume in terms of thinking about the ways in which morality and religious life can work together in healthy ways. And that has to be read alongside all the different ways Smith criticizes, like Hume, the ways in which religion, certain forms of enthusiasm and zealotry can be pernicious for moral life.
Sure. Great. Thanks. Also, more great recommendations. This is our last question.
Okay.
And so we're going to end on a slightly more personal note. Our friend Shell says, you dedicate our great purpose to your daughter. Are there any lessons which Smith has taught you over the years which have made you a better father or enriched your family life?
Oh, how much time do we have?
Well, that's largely up to you, but
Okay. Yes. So I'll say that my beloved doctoral supervisor at the University of Chicago once made an offhand comment about some of my work on Smith, where he says, well, you can kind of say that because you've been living with Smith for the past 2 decades. And I thought, my goodness, he's really right. There has been this experience where I don't just think about Smith as an academic, but it's hard for me to think about life without thinking about Smith to some extent. And I really do think that I'm better off for that. There's many different ways I could try to explain that, but I'll say one that is, I think, personal enough, and it goes back to something that was brought up earlier. It's really hard to appreciate the degree to which we're all just one of the multitude. When I got on so I live in Boston, I was making my commute on in today on the T, and I took the train, and I put in my brand new little AirPods, and I'm listening to music. And like everybody else, I'm looking at my phone and I'm wrapped up in my own world. Um, it's very difficult and a real struggle. And I struggle with this as much, I'm sure, more maybe than Smith. I don't know. Trying to appreciate the degree to which every other individual on that train, every other individual on the quad out here, every other person on the street has the mystery and complexity of their own life that they're dealing with at the same time. And to realize that one is truly no more or less important, no more or less meaningful than any other. That, I think, is a real challenge, but a very healthy challenge. And so it's one that there are days when I come closer to succeeding, many days in which I fail, but sort of learning how to, in Smith's terms, try to see oneself as one of the multitude, in more colloquial terms, to get over oneself and to realize that what we do is only so important. And at the end of the day, there are many other things and many other people that are often much more important than we are. I don't think I could have thought that particular thought in that particular way had I not spent so much time with Smith. And I do think it's a challenge he's put before me that I've tried to live up to, sometimes fail at, but am better for the struggle.
That's a really lovely answer, Ryan. And I also think it's a really interesting question to ponder whether it's more difficult in today's day and age to be one of the multitudes than perhaps it was in Smith's time. That's something that comes up in a lot of our conversations, which is perhaps particularly appropriate as you and I are having this conversation from thousands of miles apart right now. So,
Yes,
and all of these questions came in such a manner as well. So, Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. And we're really grateful for your having lived with Smith for all these years and sharing some of that life with us. It was a great read that we really enjoyed. We highly recommend the book, and we really appreciate your time to answer everyone's questions.
Well, I'm delighted that I had a chance to share a little bit about living with Smith, and I appreciate the opportunity. I hope your readers, it sounds like some of them have already, but will take up Smith and read him, because I do think, and I really believe, that time spent with Smith is never time wasted. And if the book inspires people, I mean, its real purpose is to lead people back to the original fountain. And so I really hope that people will take that up. And if they are taking it up, I say this at the beginning of all my books, and I mean it. If I can help people be of assistance in their own study of Smith, I'm happy to be a resource. And I appreciate the opportunity even to have shared this much.
Thanks, Ryan. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm sure we in fact will be reading Smith himself next. I
Good.
agree. Never time wasted. So
Okay.
enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Amy.